Welcome to Father, Son, and Holy Guest, episode number 9.
You got to introduce yourself.
Okay, well, I thought you were going to pause me. Can I just go on from here?
Yeah.
I'm Wright Culpepper. I'm co-pastor of First United Methodist Church, and I'm the father in this show.
I'm Bill Culpepper. I am also the co-pastor at First United Methodist Church in Brunswick, Georgia. I happen to be the son. And today we are talking with AnnaKate Rawles, who is, among other things, a volunteer, unofficial zoo chaplain in Zoo Atlanta.
AnnaKate was delightful to talk to, and certainly she, in fact, she's about to finish her doctoral work, and so she's very, very impressive young woman in ministry, and I'm sure having a tremendous impact at her church, St. James United Methodist in Atlanta. But yeah, she has a very, very passionate. Tell me a little bit, Bill, about you. You grew up on the coast. You know what it's like to live on a barrier island. How much thought or thinking growing up did you have about the environment and our responsibility for it?
I don't know if I ever really thought about our responsibility for it. I definitely loved going out in the woods. I still love going out in the woods if I can. But I never really thought about what it might mean to be stewards of God's creation, which AnnaKate does a lot of talk today about creation care. I don't know if I always just assumed it was something that people naturally did or naturally thought about, but I didn't grow up in a big city, so I never thought about things like the fact that they're now saying if you do rooftop gardens, it helps with the temperature control on the streets of the city, or anything like that. I've always loved nature and animals and all that, but I never really thought of maybe our theological call to creation care.
Yeah, I grew up in Fort Valley, Georgia, where it's very agricultural. In fact, my first 5 years lived right next to a farm, and I can remember going out and walking through the rows of whatever crop might be growing at that particular time. But peaches were the important economic driver for us in Fort Valley, and we were always worried about how many cold hours that we would have while the peaches were dormant, or where the peach trees were dormant. There had to be a certain number of cold hours, and then we'd get excited about the number of hours as we moved into spring, and then we had to worry about whether we were going to get too much rain, and then eventually the peaches would start growing on the trees, and we'd have to worry about hail, and so the being a part of an agricultural community, we were always aware of the weather and the importance and the impact that it had on the success of the crops that were particularly growing. But one of the things that AnnaKate mentioned was that during this time of being isolating during the COVID virus pandemic, she and her family have been spending a lot of time sitting out in the yard watching the migratory birds. And most of us probably haven't done that an awful lot. I'm sure there are a lot of people that are into birding and whatnot and know the patterns. But the thing to me was those birds have been migrating since the beginning of time. And those patterns have not changed. They've moved from cold weather to a better climate, then back from hot weather to a better climate. And the animals have taken care of themselves since the beginning of time. And I think that's a great message to us, is that God's taking care of us too, even in the midst of this crazy period of time in which we all live.
Well, let's see what AnnaKate has to say about our role in creation and what it might mean for us to be good stewards of the world.
Well, we're talking today with AnnaKate Rawles, who is on staff at St. James United Methodist Church in Atlanta, and has some creative ministry things that are going on in her life. AnnaKate, we're glad to have you with us today.
Really glad to be here.
Why don't we start with just a little bit about your story? You and I went to seminary together, but the rest of the world doesn't know that. So why don't you talk about maybe your journey to seminary or what's happened after that?
Yeah, so I went to seminary, went to Candler. Bill and I were actually interns at the Georgia Tech Wesley Foundation for a year, which was a delightful experience. I'm still blown away by campus ministers because it is a rough gig and so necessary. I came to seminary because I loved religion and theology, and felt that call in my life to go into ministry. I wasn't exactly sure what that would look like, but through seminary, learned just my pure love of the local church and being part of a congregation. After graduation, I began working as a pastor in the Louisiana Annual Conference. My first church was in Shreveport. Christ UMC were just wonderful people. And then my husband and I moved to New Orleans to work at Mulholland United Methodist. And New Orleans has a way of getting into your blood. And we didn't want to leave, but figured it was probably time to come and be closer to family. And all of my family lives in Atlanta. So we came here, and I have been at St. James for almost 2 years now.
Great. I've been to Shreveport. I went to an Independence Bowl there one time and found that the people of Shreveport were delightful people. We had a great visit there, except the Gamecocks lost their ball game, but we had a nice time there. Very generous and hospitable folks that we met.
Yeah, for sure.
Not been to New Orleans yet. Haven't had that privilege.
It is the best place in the whole world. It is hot and smelly most of the time, but wonderful all at the same time.
Good. So you grew up in the North Georgia, Atlanta area, and were you involved in church coming along, or was theology kind of late in your journey? What's the story?
I lived in the Atlanta area until I was about 2, and my father was in higher education work, and so we kind of bebopped all over the Southeast, going to different colleges. He was in fundraising, and we ended up in Spartanburg, South Carolina for the longest period of my life, where my father worked at Converse College, where I eventually would end up going to college. And my mother was a children's minister all of my life. My grandfathers, both my mother's and my father's, were ministers. My dad's dad was a Southern Baptist preacher for a long time, and then left to go into the academic world. And my mom's father was an Army chaplain who then moved into parish ministry after he retired from the Army. So ministry has been in my blood my whole life. It is something I have always been around. And all of my growing up years, I said, I will never work in the church because it is just hard. And then God has a funny way of taking what you say and shifting your whole life. So I was always interested in religion and grew up in a very faithful home. And when I got to college, I learned that not only did I enjoy and have a deep faith, but I also really loved I loved theology and getting to study the background of things and learning why in many ways we do what we do.
I want to ask about your work at the different churches. Is there a big difference between working in a church in New Orleans versus working in a church in Buckhead or even Shreveport for that?
Yeah, ministry in Shreveport looked very different than ministry in Atlanta or in New Orleans. It was kind of a suburban community out on the edge of town, and so ministry there looked a lot like going into people's homes and having dinner and really being a main part of their life in a different way than I've experienced in metropolitan churches, where you're an important part of their daily life. But a country minister looks different than a city minister, and both have been wonderful experiences. In New Orleans, everything is a party. And you plan worship and activities based on what is happening in the city, what roads are going to be closed. And if it's going to rain, you plan on the streets flooding and figuring out what that might look like. And so it was always an adventure in New Orleans. You were never quite sure what it was going to be. In Atlanta, there are so many people in the city of Atlanta that things, festivals and things like that, don't change what your actual ministry is going to look like day to day. Folks are it's just different, and it's all of them have been really wonderful to be part of.
So Bill tells me you also have some extracurricular kinds of ministry. What is beyond St. James?
Yeah, so I also volunteer every week pre-pandemic at Zoo Atlanta, where I work alongside of the animal keepers and zookeepers for the birds. So I spend all of my Friday tending to some animals, and that is always a different thing every day. We have all sorts of critters that we handle, from flamingos to giant endangered owls. We've got some really incredible little guys, some ducks that will follow you around as though you were their person. And I started doing that when I was living in New Orleans. I realized I spent a lot of time in sermons talking about giving back to the world and doing things that were fundamental to our faith to help the world. And there are so many things that I think many of us are passionate about, so many different social justice issues that we're called to be part of. And I feel like sometimes we can get so lost in all of the things that we end up frozen. And that was my experience. What was it that I was going to be spending my time trying to be part of bettering? And I decided that the zoo was a good option for me. I am passionate about creation and tending to what God has given us. And in caring for our creation, we are actually caring for others by making sure that land is not destroyed for mining or anything of that nature. We're making sure that people have food and safe places to live. And so in New Orleans, I started working at the zoo as a volunteer, where I would give keeper chats, not as a keeper, but as a volunteer, about the elephants, and found that people were really fascinated and interested in what they could do, not only to know things about the elephants, but what they could do in their everyday life to protect these animals. And I found that is as much a God thing as anything is. Learning how to care for others and to protect what we love is very much something that God has given us the gift of. We're called to have dominion over all things, but I think a better way of thinking through that is we have the great responsibility of loving and caring for what God has given. So that's where I started, interacting with hundreds of people each Friday, telling them about our elephants and then other small animals. And then I moved over to the aquarium, where I also worked with our birds. And my favorite bit of that was getting to spend time with our penguins. In New Orleans, the Audubon Aquarium has South African penguins, and they're a fascinating case study on what is happening in the larger world. Their numbers are endangered because of human overfishing and pollution. And that is a huge thing for people in that area as well. Finding food and clean water is, you know, it is the same problem that people are experiencing. And so just getting to share that information with people has been a really life-changing experience for me, that you can share the love and the good news of God by not even mentioning God, by just talking about the way we care for other things. And so I gave myself an Instagram hashtag, which was Zoo Chaplain, because who doesn't need a good Instagram hashtag? And it's kind of picked up and continued, because I really think that that's God's work as well. And it might be selfish because I enjoy the animals, but also I think the more we know about taking care of others, the better we are.
AnnaKate, I've heard people say that the book of Genesis tells us that we are to subdue the land and dominion over everything, and therefore I can do whatever I want, and it doesn't matter if I am cutting down all the trees or if I am, who cares about the animals, or whatever their argument might be from that. I assume you'd probably have a different reading of that particular call from God. Can you talk about how you kind of understand that? What does it mean to have dominion over something if it doesn't mean to have power over it?
Right. I think that to read Genesis as a take it all over, use it however you want, is an inauthentic reading of the book. You know, the Cain and Abel story, one of the ways that it can be read is that one brother begins to settle down and to change the land around him, and that angers God. And so that is why that's why one is preferred over the other, which I think is an interesting reading of it. I haven't explored that very much, but I think that's an interesting way to look at things. And the same can be said for the story of Babel. I think the creation story makes it clear that we are not the only things that are created by God, that the plants and the animals and the water and the air are also created by God. The first story tells us that we are the ones created in God's image, but every bit has a piece of God created within it. You know, I mean, when God made anything, there's that God stuff inside of them. And so to have dominion isn't to dominate, to have power over, probably. I mean, you have power when you are determining what something is going to look like. And we have the power to care for things instead of to use them for our own good.
So I'm curious where you stand in terms of climate control and what maybe this coronavirus might be in response to our care or lack of care for the world. Have you put some thoughts together on that?
I mean, I think what scientists have seen is that as climate change continues, that we are going to see more of these things happening. We as a people are unintentionally or intentionally mixing different types of animals together that in nature would never be found together. And so these diseases that we're seeing, not just COVID-19, but things like MERS and SARS and other coronaviruses, are expanding and becoming problems for humans when they haven't been before, because humans haven't been in contact with those animals in the same sort of way. So I think the more that we move into land that wildlife is in, the more we're going to see things of this nature happening. And so I think, you know, it says something about if things don't have a place to live, if they don't have good water and good air and good vegetation, they become ill, and that can spread into us as well. By caring for creatures and creation, we are helping things to remain in the way they were meant to be. And so we see less of those sorts of issues in places where there's good animal and land management. And as the world continues to change and the climate continues to change, more and more creatures are going to move outside of where they're naturally found. And we're going to keep finding these things.
So our call is to be good stewards. That's always been our message, but we tend to think how we handle our money, but it's far more than that. It's how we handle the environment that we're in, the land that we're on, the people and the animals that we interact with. All of that is maybe perhaps more important than how we handle our money.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, throughout the scriptures, folks didn't always have money. So when they gave to God, they were giving their land or their food or their water. You know, so that tithing, that stewardship really fundamentally starts in our surroundings.
What can a church do? Let's start with a local church. What can a local church do to maybe be a better steward of creation around them? And then by extension, what can an individual person or a family do as well?
Just starting with small things can make a huge difference. So what we know is that trees are good to have. And so by just planting some trees on your church property, you can really help your home in your church and your area, because trees provide oxygen, but they also provide homes for birds and other animals. And just switching from using plastic things to using compostable items, which are a little more expensive, but have a profound impact on land usage. If we don't have to just fill the landfill, then that is land that can be used for other things. And that, like, I think it was Jimmy Carter who said we should have our air at 72 and our heat at 68. And that actually makes a huge difference too in the amount of energy we use. So there's very simple things churches can do. In our congregation, we have a garden. We teach children how to plant things, and in part because we're in the city. So there are some children that may never have seen a carrot in the ground. They've only seen them in the grocery store. So we teach our children those things. And we also have chickens. So we have eggs all of the time, and to learn what that looks like. So this is an egg and it becomes a life. Or you know, it's an egg that we eat. So connecting that food chain thought is really, really helpful for Earth. By eating foods that are grown locally, we end up protecting so many species and lower our carbon footprint as well. At home, if you don't recycle, that's a huge thing. Just start recycling. Most places will let you recycle for free or for almost nothing. And taking meat out of your diet just one day makes also a profound impact. Our meat comes from all over the place, and there are a lot of places where, because we're ranching or because we're factory farming, that land has been taken for that use, and so the species in those areas are at risk because they don't have a place to live anymore. We stopped eating cows a couple of years ago, and we're also surprised how much money we saved in not buying beef products, and we didn't miss them all that much. You do that. Sometimes you really want a hamburger, but you dress up a turkey burger and it's just as good. Kind of.
Yeah, we've done some of that. A Meatless Monday has been an off and on thing at our house, cutting out dairy products for a number of reasons at our house as well. And what we have learned also is you adapt, and your body and your taste adapt too, and it's really not as hard or as a big thing as most people think it might be going into it.
For sure.
Yeah, as far as our church, we're about to bust up a parking lot and put in a lawn and plant, I don't know, 15, 20 crepe myrtle trees. So we're trying to do our part there. I hadn't thought about raising chickens before.
It's messy.
Yeah.
It's gross and messy, but fun.
One of the thoughts that I did have, though, while you were sharing that was that in this time of shutdown, we're not doing church suppers anymore. We're not doing a lot of the fellowship activities. And we've been talking about rebooting and what things are going to be like when we finally open up, because we keep kicking that can down the curb a little bit. But just in the recyclables and how we shrinking that carbon footprint. This is a good time for all churches to be thinking about that before they reopen up in full speed.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is just to see the difference in the amount of trash that even in my own family we have made by not eating out all the time, and by trying to get things from the farmers that are nearby in those like wonderful farm boxes. We waste a lot less when we think about what we're doing by using plates instead of styrofoam or whatever it is. My dishwasher is tired, but my can's happy.
But even with that too, another byproduct is you get to meet interesting people that are of the earth, so to speak, when you go to the farmers markets. And I'm very appreciative of our grocery store people and how they've kept us fed during this crisis. But there's a lot of good people out there that are more in touch with the earth. And so we can learn from them when we go and buy squash or carrots or potatoes, as opposed we really don't learn a lot when we go to the grocery store.
Right. If you don't support your local zoo, knowing that most of our zoos participate in something called the Species Survival Plan, which is an intentional breeding program amongst animals that are held in zoos and aquariums. That is saving species that were once endangered or nearly extinct. So you're not just getting to do something fun, you're also truly supporting caring for creation.
Right.
Do it like it's a great place.
All right. Well, good. All right. So we're going to transition now. We ask all of our guests the same 3 questions each time. And so we call this the Holy Trinity, the 3 questions that we ask. And the first question is, obviously you're well educated and you probably have a lot of favorite books. You're young, so we presume that maybe you're into podcasts as well. So we're curious, what are you reading and what are you listening to?
So I finished my dissertation and my doctoral degree at the end of April. And so I was reading a lot. And I have to say that currently I am reading through Agatha Christie's mysteries.
Again?
Again, because why not? I'm reading the B side of her novels, the ones that are not as famous, but are just as enjoyable. They're fun, and I really just needed some fun stuff to read. And a whodunit written in 1930s English is a good time. And in terms of podcasts, I have an NPR problem. I listen to it all of the time. So, This American Life and those sorts of things are always something I really enjoy. I don't necessarily binge one podcast right now as much as I'm enjoying those things that are just about people and things that are happening in the world that are not COVID focused. That has been where I'm finding some joy.
Good.
Yeah, I've been noticing that the podcasts that I'm listening to the most in this time are the lighter, funnier, less thinking podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
The books that I'm reading are the more fantasy or even the whodunits or whatever it is, because I need something else besides this COVID thing. And I'm hearing a lot of people say that thing. I said again because you were reading Agatha Christie in seminary when I was reading Stephen King, and it was for the exact same reason. we were so stressed out from studying everything else that we needed something else. So.
Yeah, exactly. And it's nice to go back to things later and be like, oh, this is fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis has come up a good bit in conversations, and I've got to go back and read some of his books because it's been a long time since I touched base with him. But I've enjoyed having conversations with him.
Yeah.
And certainly your sermons are a lot more interesting when you're bringing in Agatha Christie and some of the other stuff as opposed to Cain and Abel.
Right, for sure.
Right. For God is more mystery than anything, and so a good mystery is good theology.
I think so.
Yes. Yeah.
So the second question would be, is there any particular book of the Bible or verse or story from the Bible that has informed your life in general or the work that you do now?
The Magnificat is really kind of my driving force in everything I do in my life. Remembering that God is with those who are oppressed, that God is with those who have been marginalized, and that God continues to lift them up. I think for me,
what the Magnificat is for people who might not know that word.
Yeah, so it's the Song of Mary from Luke 2, and it is similar to the song rather that Miriam sings in Exodus, and it is just it's a passage about the reversal, and God. I think you hit it that God is mysterious, and there's that. I had someone, a mentor, who said that God's middle name is surprise, and that in everything we're doing, that's really what drives us, is this idea that God is calling us to be God's hands and feet, and to change the world around us.
Yeah, and I really think that we are in that day and age where God is doing some changes, and we're resisting it with every ounce of energy that we've got. We don't like change, but change is happening, and we should embrace it. Should's not a good word. That's a shaming word, but we would be better off if we embraced the change as opposed to trying to hold on and keep everything the way it was, because the way it was may have worked well 3 decades ago, but we're in a whole new world. And so, but God has always acted on behalf of the oppressed, whether it be women, whether it be people of color, whether it be the poor, whether mental health, or whether it be the animals. God has always acted on their behalf. So embrace that activity. So where do you the third question, where do you most experience God in your life right
now? So just generally, I also started working or volunteering at the zoo as a way to take a Sabbath. Everyone knows that from 8 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, I can't be reached because I don't have my phone, because it would fall into the ponds or whatever I'm working with. And I chose that as Sabbath because Sabbath is about resting, but it's also about being in the presence of God. And I think when you witness animals doing what they do, you can't help but to believe in an incredible God that makes the most ridiculous animals, like flamingos, make zero sense at all, but there they are with their backwards knees and all. And just in the peace and the quiet of those creatures. And we have been sitting outside a lot because when you've been in your home for 78 days, the walls start to fall around you. So I've been experiencing God in that same sort of environment of sitting outside and watching the migratory birds come through our yard has been pretty incredible. And spending all of our time with our dog and our cat, the empathy and the care that they show us and that we show them is pretty remarkable. So God and I connect best in the midst of that. but also I see God in the midst of the protests, fighting for Black lives, and in the midst of communities who are wearing masks to protect others. I think anywhere we're seeing people care for others really is a God sighting.
AnnaKate, thank you so much. For running out of time. Is there anything you want to plug, or if someone wants to get in contact with you, what's a great way to do that?
Again, I think do what you can, start something small to change the way you're interacting with your environment. And I can be found online and at AnnaKate at stjamesatlanta.org.
So that's St. James Church in Atlanta. So ST, no period, stjames.org. Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you so much, AnnaKate. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Come visit us at the beach.
Absolutely.
Okay. Look forward to meeting you.
See you later.